America, and then finally Latin America's own drug problem. We begin with the bureaucratic landscape. The United States, of course, is a very complicated government. The White House on top, the president presides. Drug Enforcement Agency plays a central role in our war on drugs and our policy towards illicit drugs in Latin America and the Caribbean. But it's not the only federal agency that deals with drugs. Far from it. The landscape is littered with dozens of federal, regional, and state-level agencies, all of them working together or against each other in confronting illicit drug trade, trafficking, and of course use. There are 43 federal agencies alone involved in American drug policy globally, which includes, of course, Latin America, and they're very often struggling with and against each other. They're doing so for primacy, for attention, and for resources, or they simply struggle with each other because they speak different bureaucratic languages and have different protocols. There are several different theories of bureaucratic behavior that we can apply to American foreign policy. There is what we call RAM, or Rational Actor Model, Organizational Politics Model, or the OP model, and then BP, which is Bureaucratic Politics Model. They explain foreign policy bureaucracies in stark terms. Let's begin with the Rational Actor Model. It is by far the simplest and most straightforward. It is the ideal model for foreign policy making. It imagines the U.S. government as a unitary actor, with a very clear head, which is the president, with information from all of the agencies flowing upward, being vetted and filtered, analyzed and polished, and ultimately making it to the president's desk. The assumption is that when the president and his or her team consider a foreign policy option, they have all of the best information at their disposal. Decisions flow downward in an authoritative fashion. When the president speaks, when the president decides, that is the policy that is implemented. And the country's overall interest, it is assumed in this model, prevail over all local, regional, and political interests. It's the perfect model of foreign policy, and if only foreign policy operated in this fashion. The organizational politics model has a very different system. It sees a number of organizations that are arrayed across the government, all of them involved in various foreign policy issues. For some issues, it's only a handful. For ones like drug policy, 3 or more dozen of them. They each have a head, Secretary of State, Director of Central Intelligence, the highest ranking members of the military, whether it's in the Pentagon or the Chiefs of Staff, all of them represented at the top. But these individual organizations have their own agendas, their own bureaucratic language, and their own interest. And it's their own parochial interest that oftentimes are pursued. We would like to think that the Defense Department and the State Department work together, as much as we'd like to think that the CIA and FBI work together. But oftentimes they hide information from each other, they're competing against each other, and they view each other as bureaucratic rivals. That's the organizational politics model. And finally, and somewhat similar, is the bureaucratic politics model. Here we look only at the leadership of each of those organizations and where they sit around the table when the president enters the room. So clearly the head of the table is for the president, in the president's absence, the vice president, and then everyone else is arrayed around the table, and where you sit determines where you stand. Meaning whatever label you have, SecDef, SecState, Director of CIA, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that determines your policy position. And if you have someone that moves from one institution in the government to another, it's amazing how quickly their policy issues change, their positions change, because where you sit around the table is where you stand on policy issues. And these elite policymakers, the heads of these large bureaucratic organizations, they trade horses with one another. They make trade-offs. They cut side deals. They're trying to create a winning coalition to gain the president's attention. It's called fighting for the president's ear. And if the president is listening to you, it's more likely that financial resources and responsibility will flow in your direction. That's the bureaucratic politics model. When we look at American agencies that deal with drug policy in Latin America, we cannot for a moment view this as the rational actor model. It is organizational and bureaucratic politics without any question. And that, of course, is not optimal. But it's not just about the United States. We're just one of many important players in the global battle against illicit drug trafficking and trade. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there are dozens of countries, each with their own bureaucratic battles. And somehow we have to overcome all of those battles, including ones with us, if we're going to coordinate policy across the entire region. What is the extent of the drug problem in the United States? The numbers don't tell us everything, but we do know that annually $150 billion of illegal drugs enter the United States. What does that mean in terms of cost for the U.S.? We'd have to calculate all of the medical treatments, the law enforcement efforts to crack down on drug dealers and drug consumers, the crime that is often related with addiction to drugs, and don't forget the lost productivity. When people become sick because of drugs, they can't go to work. When they die, we lose a lifetime of productivity. So the drug problem in the United States is enormous. Putting a price tag on it is virtually impossible. Here we can see the main global trafficking routes for illicit drugs. There are three sources. There is the so-called Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. That includes Myanmar, one of our great decisions this year. There is that Golden Crescent, which basically begins in Afghanistan, and then it has its travel routes throughout Africa and Europe, and then finally today's great decisions challenge, Latin America. As we look at our hemisphere, the drugs are largely produced in South America. They find their way to Central America, into Mexico, Caribbean islands, and on to the United States. The moment we crack down on land routes, the sea routes open up. We crack down on the sea routes, that opens the door for land routes. Very difficult to prevent the drugs from flowing into the United States. And once they reach our boundaries, they have a national network of highways and byways that they can use to spread across our great nation and poison our population. Latin America's drug problem is relatively straightforward. There are only 3 countries that promote or cultivate coca. That is, of course, the base of cocaine. They are Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. But from them, the drugs flow throughout the region and, of course, northward to the major markets in North America. In fact, 90% of the cocaine produced in South America arrives on American shores. The other 10% makes its way to Africa, to Europe, and beyond. Let's now consider American foreign policy options as it relates to drug policy. 3 main areas of focus. There's the source of the drugs, where they're cultivated, where they're grown, where they're produced. Once they have finished production, there are transit routes that take them out of region and towards the United States and large markets, and then finally the destination, which with cocaine in Latin America is overwhelmingly the United States. And it's the same for marijuana and other illicit drugs. Let's begin with the source. Well, we do have options at our disposal. We can fly planes over crops and poison them. We can spray all sorts of agents, chemicals on them that will make the leaves wilt and turn brown and ultimately die. We can do this on the ground directly with the assistance, of course, of local governments. And we can also go there and simply burn the fields to the ground. The problem is that these fields are so massive in size, and very oftentimes they're in areas that are very difficult to get to. Add to that the reality that if we're going to spray toxins over these areas, defoliants, as we used in Vietnam with Agent Orange, we're going to cause a lot of civilian damage, deformation, and death. There have been major moves to have locals replace their coca production with other profitable market items such as coffee or soy, rice, or cotton. This is something that can happen if we're willing to subsidize it. Basically do abroad what we do for our farmers here at home, give them a leg up economically so that they can make a profit by selling in a highly competitive market. We cannot ask locals in Bolivia and Peru, among others, to give up a highly profitable drug production growth for something that's less economically rewarding. That just invalidates economic rational thinking. So we'd have to help them along the way. But there's a major problem with subsidies. Not only do we not provide them significantly for foreign farmers, we do provide them for our own farmers. So we have poor countries in Latin America, very wealthy countries like the United States. We funnel enormous amounts of taxpayer dollars to our farmers. And when I say farmers, I don't mean mom and pop operations. I mean conglomerates with CEOs, lawyers, ad agencies in New York City and Houston and Los Angeles. They wear the $3,000 Italian suits. They probably wouldn't know one end of a shovel from another, but they're operating these massive farming industries. They have lobbyists that are very well paid on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C., and they're going to make sure that policies are going to be directed in the favor of their conglomerates, in the favor of their industries. So we pay farmers not to grow products. If they do grow them, we pay them not to sell them, and we pay them to store the products that they've grown that we're also paying them not to sell, both domestically and internationally. And what this does is it creates a very high profit margin for these conglomerate agricultural industries and allows them to sell their products both domestically and abroad very cheaply. In poor countries, where there isn't that enormous tax base to tap into, there aren't these sorts of subsidies. And what that means is that their farmers cannot compete. If we ask them to compete directly with us and our subsidies, they're going to migrate north. They're coming to the United States, or if they stay at home, they're going to turn to illegal drug production. They really don't have a lot of other options. So we're clamping down on migration, we're subsidizing our farmers, and we're somehow surprised that poor farmers in South America are growing coca and other illicit products. All right, if the source cannot be addressed, why don't we cut them off at the pass? Prevent those drugs from reaching the final destination. So let's take a look at how this works. There is the coca field. Inside of it, you've got the production, accumulation, and then initial transit to the production labs. We've already spoken of how the original point of production is very hard to get to. How about the production labs? Those are as well armed as any labs you'll find in the world. Premium, grade A military force with the best weaponry that drug money can buy. It would be a war in those countries for the governments to go after the production labs. And of course, the way that it works is that if the military of, say, Mexico attacks a production lab for marijuana, those production labs, those criminal elements are not going to go to war with their own government and military. They're going to commit acts of terrorism and attack on innocent populations, knowing that the population will then pressure the government of Colombia, of Mexico, or one of the others to halt their war on drugs. So cutting them off there is also difficult. The weakest point in this delivery chain is with the transit of the runners. These are people that are delivering. They're sometimes called mules. They're delivering the drugs across international boundaries to hand off to a new set of runners. We can attack them pretty easily, and that's what we tend to focus upon. Low risk for us and local governments, and a very high rate of success. The problem is that these runners are 14-year-olds. They're people who are very easily replaced. They are literally a dime a dozen in most of these countries. So as long as there are young people without jobs or futures, there will always be people to replace the runner that we just arrested and incarcerated. That certainly is not going to answer the question. So why don't we go to the real problem, which is the destination point, the demand side of the economic curve. Those drugs are produced and shipped to the United States for a singular reason. We are the market for them. We demand the drugs, we consume the drugs, we pay very high prices for those drugs. We can solve this problem with focusing on the United States. And what that means is that drug policy isn't just domestic and it's not just international, it is both of them at the same time. Our domestic policy is affected by our foreign drug policy, and our foreign policy is affected by our domestic drug policy. We call this issue intermestic. It's international and domestic at the same time, and it's one of the reasons there are 43 federal agencies and literally hundreds and thousands of state-level agencies involved in the drug policy. If we could succeed in dealing with the destination, American demand for drugs, it would solve the transit route problem and the source problem. If there's not a profit to be made, these criminal organizations are not going to produce an illegal drug. If they do, it'll be for shipment to other places on the globe. So how do we curb demand? What do we do about America's seemingly insatiable appetite for illicit drugs? The spectrum is wide. We can go the hardline route of law and order, hiring more police, more border guards, more sea patrols, and building a lot more prisons. Or we can go to the other end of the spectrum, the soft line side, and legalize at least some drugs. Take the criminal element out of it, as proponents argue. Law and order, we've been trying that since the 1980s at a minimum. It was in the 1980s, Mr. Reagan said, we're going to go after drugs. Mrs. Reagan said, just say no. But the government decided to begin incarceration with mandatory sentencing for drug offenders. And just look at the population explosion among American prisoners. So we have the Nixon Declaration, we have the Reagan Sentencing Reform Act. Put those two together, and we don't have enough prisons to hold them all. There are very few countries in the world that incarcerate a higher percentage of their citizens than the United States. And we could continue this curve right out into 2022, and the numbers are up, and away. Now the major trend is private prisons. So we have, again, corporations with profit motive, high-paid lobbyists in Washington directing resources to build private prisons, who have an incentive to encourage the sort of domestic policies and laws and sentencing that will send more customers to them. And of course, by customer, I mean prisoners. So if law and order isn't working, how about legalization? There's a strong movement in this country, and many U.S. states now have legalized pot or marijuana. But this never works because you can't legalize cocaine. You can't legalize methamphetamines. You can't legalize so many of the very hard drugs, the dangerous killing drugs that are very popular in the United States. And even legalizing marijuana won't work. I mean, companies will make a profit and people will smoke, I guess you'd call it safe weed, but there's always going to be a demand for stronger marijuana, stronger beyond the envelope of what domestic law allows, and there will always be a demand for cheaper marijuana. Legalizing it raises the price. It must be regulated, inspected, taxed, and as a result of that, the price of marijuana goes up, And that means there's always a market for less expensive, i.e. illegal, marijuana being shipped in, including marijuana that is much, much stronger than what people can get through the legal resources. Legalization doesn't work, law and order doesn't seem to work, but there's a whole array of options in between, both domestic and international. From a foreign policy point of view, if the United States is going to succeed, short of ending American demand for drugs, which no one sees happening in the future, we have to get along better with the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean. We need to build trust with Mexico first, because when there is something that happens across that border and we want to send the FBI or other special agents over to investigate, we need the Mexicans to cooperate with us and to allow us access to those areas. And if we don't have good relations with them, and if we can't trust them, then we can't work with them. Mexico is the first point of focus, but it very quickly becomes all of Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. That is a very tall order, and one historically that we have not been terribly successful at. We have a poisoned relationship with Cuba, and many countries in Latin America refuse to work with us on important issues until we can get beyond the Cuban issue. Beyond that, there is the very chilly relationship we've historically had with Brazil, the largest and most influential country in the region. So rather than thinking of policy that includes all of Latin America and the Caribbean, we should focus on Mexico first, clean up our mess of a policy in Cuba, which serves no one's interest economically or politically, and then work very hard on a better relationship with Brazil. From there, we can branch out and perhaps have more success in heading off the illegal drugs that are entering this country. Solving the destination is first, but focusing on foreign policy and better relations certainly has to be part of the calculation. Thank you once again for attending this lecture as we move quickly towards the end of the 2022 series. Stay engaged and make great decisions. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022. We have considered in this course 8 very interesting and challenging foreign policy issues. Today, we have a bonus lecture for you, the Biden Foreign Policy Agenda. I would like to begin by thanking the Foreign Policy Association for inviting me to craft and to deliver these 9 lectures in this master class. I would also like to congratulate each of you for taking the time and energy to read the handbook, to listen to the lectures, and to engage in American foreign policy discussion. Our foreign policy desperately needs a highly informed and engaged citizenry. By participating in this Great Decisions program, you are fulfilling one of your obligations as a citizen in our great democracy. There will be 3 main considerations before we turn our attention to Mr. Biden's foreign policy: the inheritance from his predecessor, domestic versus foreign policy, and finally this first-year experience for Mr. Biden. Because of the lengthy production period, these lectures were written and videotaped in late October and early November of 2021. That allows us enough time to get the DVDs produced and in your inbox by January of 2022 for your Great Decisions groups. Having said that, it is obvious that many of the things that happen in world affairs between November of 2021 and the time that you're watching this video, likely in March or April of 2022, will not be covered in this presentation. So let's look at the foreign policy inheritance of each American president since 1945. Mr. Truman's was profoundly negative. The Second World War was still underway when he was inaugurated as president at the time of the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. An international organization, the United Nations, had to be built, and political alliances had to be formed. Eisenhower's inheritance was better, but still on the negative side. The superpowers were beginning to learn to live with one another. We knew more about the Soviets in 1953 than we did in 1944. Also, the war in Korea was winding down. For the most part, the guns had fallen silent, and it was a matter of negotiating an end to that conflict. Kennedy's inheritance was not particularly positive. The Soviet Union was becoming more aggressive, reaching out into the world, finding allies abroad. Cuba had fallen in 1959, putting a lot of pressure on JFK. And without a doubt, Moscow viewed this young, dapper president as someone that they could take advantage of. LBJ's inheritance, little changed. The Vietnam War was just beginning. The disaster of that campaign falls squarely on the shoulders of Johnson. So he left behind a worse situation for his successor, Richard Nixon, who was truly shackled to the ongoing war in Vietnam. We'll skip over Gerald Ford, a very short-term president, and when we get to Carter, for the first time since 1945, we have a very positive political inheritance for U.S. foreign policy. The table is set for success. Israel and the Egyptians are talking to one another, and while he deserves a great deal of credit for finishing the Camp David Accords, much of that legwork had already been done. There was not this overwhelming challenge to American security outside of the continuation of the Cold War. So Carter's inheritance was highly positive. Having said that, Carter's foreign policy stumbled badly in places like Iran, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and in superpower arms control relations, meaning Ronald Reagan inherited a pretty difficult landscape in 1981. He was, however, among the most successful American foreign policy presidents, ending the Cold War on our terms and peacefully with the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan ushered in a whole new era in world affairs and a unique American moment in world politics, a unipolar moment where no country could begin to challenge American dominance. That meant that the senior George Bush had a highly favorable foreign policy inheritance. He left behind to Bill Clinton a slightly improved one. Iraq and its power growth had been checked in the 1991 conflict in the Gulf, and Clinton largely was left to navigate the unfolding and emerging post-Cold War era. The junior George Bush had an even more favorable foreign policy inheritance. The war in Bosnia and Kosovo over, lessons had been learned in Somalia. The Soviet leader, now Russian of course, Vladimir Putin, was profoundly weak in early 2001. George W. Bush had a highly positive foreign policy inheritance, but he left behind a worse landscape because Mr. Obama had to deal with those two wars, the one in Iraq and the one in Afghanistan, neither of which the Americans could conclude on their terms, and in many ways, neither of which the Americans could conclude. We seem to be stuck in foreign policy, and 7 years after 9/11, Osama bin Laden was still alive and posting international videos. Trump administration had a pretty positive foreign policy inheritance. The Iran nuclear deal had been completed. Osama bin Laden was dead, and it seemed that we were on our way towards winding down the missions in both Afghanistan and in Iraq. Libya was left a mess by the 2011 Obama intervention, but aside from that, Mr. Trump had a pretty favorable inheritance, and he left an equally favorable, if not slightly improved one, for Joe Biden. One war to exit, and no real hot crisis to confront globally, aside from, of course, the global pandemic. COVID, in many ways, was an opportunity for Joe Biden, and I mean that in a pure political sense, not in a healthcare sense, in that it appeared that the waves had been put behind us, vaccines were available, and by all calculations, we were exiting from the era of COVID. How the international health community was wrong with that assumption. Let's take a look at this relationship between domestic and foreign policy. Each president has challenges in both arenas, locally and internationally, and a very big part of their foreign policy will be the extent to which they focus on foreign versus domestic affairs.